This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas of all types and vocations who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a sociologist at the University of Haifa, specializing, among other things, in immigration. We are here to discuss her most recent book, South African Jews in Israel, Assimilation in Multigenerational Perspective, that was recently published in English by the University of Nebraska Press. Professor Rebeca Raijman, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hello, and thank you for the invitation.
So by way of introduction, before we discuss the actual migration issue, let's explore the characteristics of the Jewish community in South Africa. What would you say are the main points of difference between the Jewish community in South Africa and other Jewish communities in Western English-speaking countries?
The main difference between the Jewish community in South Africa and, let's say, in the United States is the Zionist attachment, and especially attachment to Israel. But this is not only relevant for the South African community, it's also relevant, for example, for the Argentinian Jewish community in Israel. So both communities were founded by immigrants from Lithuania and developed a very rich infrastructure of institutions, not only synagogues, but also schools, primary schools, secondary schools, and also the Zionist movements were very active, and people also live a kind of segregated life in their communities and developed not just an attachment to Zionism, but also to Israel. So, and this is very important because if you compare it, for example, with other immigrants that are coming to Israel, let's say, for example, immigrants from the former Soviet Union, this primary attachment to Israel was not present there. Okay, so people are coming here with, as I said, it's a strong attachment to Israel, but also knowing some Hebrew, knowing the culture and also the religious, but not Orthodox religious. Okay, so at least those arriving in Israel before the 90s. So the synagogue was there, the center of their lives, and it was not only just for religious activities, it also for social activities, and people spend their social lives around these religious congregations.
So Jewish life in South Africa thrived over the years.
Yes.
Despite the very problematic political situation there and of course, the racial segregation and later morphed into tensions, were the Jews safe in all this, or did part of their community life evolve as some sort of reaction to the instability outside?
Well, I think that, no, I think it was a consequence of the richness of the Jewish community, because you have the same type of Jewish life in Argentina, where you don't have this kind of political problems. So it was, for example, in South Africa, till today, there is a high percentage of people sending their children to Jewish schools. So Jewishness is very, very, very strong.
But you wouldn't say that the political situation influenced the evolution or perhaps the shaping of Jewish life in South Africa?
Well, it helped, but in an indirect way. There was not such a South African identity. So people, especially among the white communities, they developed a strong sense of ethnic identities. And this was a common thing to do. So the Jewish community was the center of their lives and still continues to be for those who remain there. Because as we know, almost half of the Jewish community left the country, left South Africa.
Which is, again, a very remarkable thing about South Africa, because as opposed to other Western countries, aliyah from everywhere, immigration from everywhere is determined by the so-called push and pull factors. And from the West, it's mainly pull factors. People are being exceptionally Zionist and want actively to come to Israel. But in South Africa's case, which is more like other, perhaps the Soviet Union, for example, the push factors were stronger. And that, in a way, created that big crisis of Jewish community in South Africa that almost halved over the years.
Yeah, but it was, the emigration was relevant not only for the Jewish community, but also for other white communities, because in every political upheaval and crisis, people were afraid of violence and political instability. So this was for sure an important factor. But when you look, for example, at the reasons, you look exactly at the importance of push and pull reasons, you will see that it's okay, it's correct. South African Jews coming to Israel left because of political instability, because of violence, etc., etc. But if you compare this in statistical terms with the importance attributed to the push factors, you will see that most of the South African, they left the country because political instability, but they decided to come to Israel because they are Zionist values, because they wanted to live a Jewish life. They wanted to belong to the majority, not to the minority. And this is mostly the main reason for coming here.
Yet, Israel wasn't always the number one destination for South African Jews. There was a period of time when there were more Jews emigrating from South Africa to Australia than to Israel. How does that fit into the mold?
At the beginning, Israel was one of the most important destinations, because people coming here were motivated by Zionism and religious reasons. So at least most of people that we interviewed, Israel was their first destination. But they were asked by many friends, why are you coming to Israel? Go to Australia, go to England, where you can speak your own language and you will live a life that is similar to the life you are living here in South Africa. So it was, I think that mostly people living during the 60s, 70s and 80s were more motivated to come to Israel. But during the last years, late 90s and the 2000s, South African Jews living in South Africa go to other destinations. But still, we have a permanent number of people coming around the 250. And I think this is very important, that we have at least a small but stable number.
Right.
Because if you look, for example, at the Argentinian community, so that overall, during the 70s, 80s, and 90s, around 1,500 people were coming every year. And now less than 200 are coming. So you should look it in comparative perspective.
What can you tell us really about the patterns of aliyah, of settling in Israel, and the unique characteristics thereof in the case of the South African community, as opposed, again, to other English-speaking aliyah and aliyah in general? Argentina, you said, is a good reference point.
Okay. In the book, my data focuses only on the South African immigrants coming to Israel. But I have also data on other communities. And South Africans are very similar in their characteristics to immigrants coming from the United States and from England. They are high-skilled immigrants, those coming in the first generation, of course. That the first generation is those arriving above the age of 18. So they are very well educated and they work in professional managerial occupations. Many of them are coming with relatively intermediate levels of Hebrew proficiency that
thanks to the Jewish education.
Thanks to the Jewish education, and because when you go to the synagogue and you pray, you are used to read. So it's interesting because when we ask people coming to Israel about their Hebrew proficiency before arrival, so you can see that reading was much higher proficient than speaking skills. And this is because they were used to read, okay?
Yeah, sure.
But one very interesting point about Anglo speakers is that when you look over time, their proficiency or their ability to get to the higher levels of Hebrew proficiency is much lower compared to immigrants coming from Latin American countries or French countries.
How do you explain that?
Because, first of all, because they have less need to invest in in Hebrew skills, because they can manage with English. In English. So, in English, you can also get an extra bonus in your income because of your English skills. So English is very important in Israeli society. So mostly I am talking about those coming as adults, okay? Not about those arriving as children and the second generation that they have excellent Hebrew skills. Yeah.
And what about institutions? Did they really replicate the same kind of institutional infrastructure that they knew in their home country that, as you said, had very, very deep roots all the way back to Lithuania?
Yes, but first of all, they have Telfed, that is the Zionist South African Federation in Israel. So this is an institution that works for the new immigrants, but also is involved in the process of bringing immigrants to Israel. They have many facilities for these immigrants coming from South Africa. Among them, for example, they own buildings with apartments that can be rented at lower prices. That if you compare this to the open market, to South African immigrants.
Is it something that is really unique to the...
this is unique.
So you would say that the South African community in Israel is more closely knit than other immigrant communities?
Yes. At least I am talking about Telfed, this organization. If you compare it to other organizations, it's a strong organization. It has financial capabilities, so they can help South African immigrants coming to Israel. But also we can see the synagogues. So the synagogues, many of the synagogues in Ra'anana or in Bet Shemesh or in other places, that many of them are organized in a similar way as they were organized back in South Africa. And even they were created by South African immigrants. But of course, not only South African immigrants are coming to synagogues. Anglo speakers from other countries are also...
The subtitle of your book mentions the phrase multigenerational perspective. That perhaps is a more methodological question, but what does it mean exactly for the purposes of migration research?
Okay, so because the theories in immigrant assimilation suggest that the way to examine integration of immigrants in a host society is not just to look to the achievements of the first generation, because the first generation, they are coming above the age of 18, so they most of them acquire their education in their home countries. Usually they don't have the skills, the Hebrew skills. They don't know the rules of the game in the Israeli society. They don't have networks. So for them, it takes a long time until they integrate. And in order to see the real process of integration of a specific group, you have to look not only how the first generation immigrants integrate, but the ways the further generations integrate. In this case, I look into the so-called 1.5 generation that relates to those arriving as children. Okay. And the second generation that relates to those who were born in Israel to at least one South African parent. And then if even studies suggest to look into the third generation in order to have a better overview of the process of integration. And this is what I wanted to do, okay, with this particular group. And also what I did, for example, in the last part of the book, I wanted to show how this group is different from other immigrant groups coming to Israel. So
and one of them that you mentioned on a few occasions already, and also our listeners by now may have gathered listening to your accent, that it's a group that an immigrant group that you're closely familiar with, and that is the Argentinian one. Yeah. You said that the South African and Argentinian communities are remarkably similar. While working on this book,
not similar in Israel, but similar in their countries of origin.
So that's even more interesting, because coming to Israel, they kind of lose their similarity?
It's not that they lose their similarity. So their starting point, they are similar in their Zionism and their attachment to Israel and to Jewishness. They are similar in these issues. But, of course, the processes are very different because, for example, Argentinians don't speak English. They speak Spanish.
Right.
So Spanish is not a skill or it's not a language you can convert into...
It's not an asset.
It's not an asset as the English language, of course. So if you compare, for example, the achievements in the labor market, you will see that South Africans are at the top. Okay. And I would say that people coming from Latin America, because the data I have, it's for Latin Americans, they are in the middle. Their achievements are more or less similar to the native-born Israelis. Okay, so because also the level of education of those coming from Argentina to Israel is much lower than the level of education of South Africans coming to Israel.
But do you feel that being an Argentinian immigrant yourself gave you some sort of valuable perspective for this endeavor, for this study into South Africa?
Definitely. For example, when it gave me a perspective, especially when people were telling me their stories and their lives back in South Africa, because their way of living was so similar to the way I was brought up in Argentina. So that even I wrote this in the introduction, that I felt that they were telling my life story. So in that way, this is the reason I am saying the communities were very similar in their organizations.
Right. Yeah. That's very interesting, Professor Rebeca Raijman. Thank you very much for joining us today to discuss your new book, South African Jews in Israel, Assimilation in Multigenerational Perspective. It recently came out in English, was published by the University of Nebraska Press. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you.
And also big thanks to Alex Banish, our sound engineer, and to the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast, there are many more where it came from. Just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick.
כרגע זה נראה לא טוב, אוי, חייל קרבי, אומרים שבקרוב, אוי, כי אהובי הוא, לא מדברים על סוף, אם הוא רק יהיה לי, וגם זה טוב.